And Natasha, you can start putting up your slides. So we are very, very lucky and very happy to have Natasha Phelps with us today. She's the director of the Equity Center, Centered Policy at the Center for Black Health and Equity. Prior to joining the center, Natasha worked as a litigation attorney at a private defense firm and as a managing lead senior staff attorney at the Public Health Law Center, where she provided legal and technical assistance on commercial tobacco control, equitable public health policy issues, and she did that for the public health professionals and organizations, legal professionals and advocates throughout the United States. She also serves on the board of Planned Parenthood Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota Action Fund, and taught as an adjunct professor at the Mitchell-Hamline College of Law in Minnesota. Welcome. We're really excited to have you here, Natasha, and thank you for coming and joining us and helping us with our tobacco control.
Thank you, Carlo, and thank you to the Maryland Tobacco Control Resource Center for having me today to join you at your Best Practices Conference. I am very happy to be here today, and I was asked to come to really speak about African-American smoking habits and issues facing Black health when it comes to smoking and cessation, so initiation and cessation, and specifically touching on, of course, when we're talking about African-Americans who smoke, flavored tobacco policy, giving a little bit of an update on what's going on with state and local flavor work, and then also what's going on with the FDA. So I decided to really take what we have typically talked about when we talk about flavored tobacco policy and give it an important perspective, especially because the focus for my presentation is on Black health, and really kind of categorizing it as a historical presentation, because when we're talking about Black health and flavored tobacco and Black smoking habits, it's really important to think about Black health in a country without menthol. And so I just wanted to give a quick disclaimer before I start moving forward with my presentation. When I'm referring to a country, of course, I'm talking about the United States, but I just want to recognize our indigenous family. I live in Minneapolis, Minnesota, on the ancestral and contemporary homelands of the Dakota people. And so just referring to the term country, referring to United States as it has come to be known. So I am really here today to talk about the importance of comprehensive flavored tobacco policy and all of the work that goes into it. So if you're a scientist, a researcher, a community activist, whatever your role is in the commercial tobacco world, I hope this presentation will be helpful to you. But, flavored tobacco policy is both a means of preventing commercial tobacco initiation in the Black community, but also as a means of ensuring sustained nicotine cessation. And I think often when we talk about flavored tobacco policy, we miss out on the cessation piece. But so much of the discussion when we're talking about initiation or prevention and cessation in our discussion, strategy, messaging, planning, evaluating the studies is about future impact, how flavor bans will reduce initiation and will help to ensure cessation when the time comes. And really to get people to stop smoking because of interest in alternative but unflavored product alternatives. And how to ensure that the research and the policymaking, education, and all of that is really grounded in equity. And all of that is well and good. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in talking about how to ground the flavored tobacco policy work in equity, which I will be talking about today. There's a lot of improvement that needs to be considered, but I want to go even deeper today in these next 45 minutes or so, just to highlight why an equity-centered approach in commercial tobacco control, whether you're a scientist, a cessation counselor, researcher, community activist, or policymaker, when you're working in flavored tobacco, it really does mean to consider, understand, and acknowledge and incorporate what was going on, the systemic oppression that existed even before flavored tobacco products hit the market, and how systemic oppression allowed flavored tobacco products to explode since then. And so when we look at that, what does it look like to really address those who are or have been addicted to these previously available products? If a flavor ban goes in place, what does it look like to really support them with that acknowledgement? once those products are off the shelf. And so I'm talking about all flavored tobacco products in general, and I'm talking about its impact on marginalized communities in general, but I'm using Black health and menthol cigarettes specifically as an example, both before the existence of menthol and since menthol hit the market, to really highlight my point. So just a little bit of background before we dive into things. And I'm sorry, I meant to put my closed captioning on, because on the screen right now, you will see a GIF, and it's of a young girl who is signing good afternoon in American Sign Language. I just wanted to take a quick minute here to let you know that I do have closed captioning on at the bottom of my screen. I don't know if you have that on for your Zoom application, but I will try my best to speak clearly so closed captioning can capture my words. And there will be images on the screen. If you would like a copy of my presentation with image descriptions, please reach out to me after the presentation. I'm sorry that that's not ready beforehand. And then the other thing I want to say is some of my slides are very text heavy. Please do not feel obligated to capture everything in your notes as I move through the presentation. And please do not feel frustrated if you're unable to read everything. I think it's really, if you're able to do that, great. Really, I want you to be able to get the essence of what I am saying, and just know that the slides will be sent out after the conference, and please contact me if you have any additional questions.
And we can see the closed captions, Natasha.
Great, thank you, Carlo. So also just a short introduction to who I am. Carlo already told you a little bit about me. I am the Director for Equity-Centered Policies at the Center for Black Health and Equity. But what is the Center for Black Health and Equity? Hopefully most, if not all of you, I hope, know who we are. But the Center for Black Health and Equity is a nonprofit organization, a nonprofit public health organization committed to the pursuit of health justice for people of African descent. And we do that by building community capacity, developing infrastructure, and developing and promoting equity-centered policy. And so we're really about giving back to the community, working closely with the community, and we measure our impact and the value of the work that we do by the development of the community to work on health justice. So we believe in investing in these communities, giving them the resources that they need, providing them with the high quality service that they deserve, that they should be getting in general, and shouldn't really have to be doing this work to repair issues in their community. But when we do that, we really develop genuine and trusted connections with these communities, and are really become an expert on Black health because it's a community-centered approach in our learning and in our strategy. But like I said, today, I'm here to talk to you about Black health in a country with and without menthol. So that's really the theme. So I want you to think about what that means, a country without menthol. When I say that, you might be thinking about the future, which is, I think, what we're all aiming towards, with the FDA banning the manufacturing of menthol. But I'm also going to take us back and talk about what the United States looked like before menthol hit the market. So the reason I'm doing this is that in order to effectively address the prevention and cessation of commercial tobacco products, and really to engage in the commercial tobacco work, regardless of what field you're in, you have to do so with the intention and the knowledge and intention to repair the systemic oppression that really created and fueled big tobacco. And the specific focus I'm going to use in order to highlight that, like I mentioned before, is the understanding of the state of Black health in the US prior to flavored tobacco products, and specifically menthol cigarettes, hitting the market, and how that has worsened in certain ways since the industry's targeting and exploitation. And then why it's important to incorporate these learnings. If we actually want to get to a place where menthol is off the market, all flavored products are off the market, and we still are seeing an improvement in Black health. Because I think once you look at what it means to actually be targeted and be the target of systemic oppression, knowing that the removal of a product from the market that you're addicted to is going to force you to stop using or force you to treat your nicotine addiction, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to have other damaging effects, just because we know a lot of the reasons why some people go deeper into their nicotine addiction. Okay, so let's talk about flavored tobacco in general, which I'm sure I haven't been to all of the sessions today, but I'm sure folks have maybe touched on this before. But we know when it comes to flavored tobacco that marginalized populations have been disproportionately targeted and thus use flavored tobacco products. Targeting women back in the 1950s with menthol cigarettes, targeting the LGBTQ plus community, those who are low socioeconomic, living in neighborhoods that are really flooded with tobacco retailers with cheap flavored tobacco products. These marginalized populations have a lot of reasons why their prevalence of use for these flavored tobacco products are higher than non-marginalized or a general population. We also know that almost 9 out of 10 African Americans aged 12 and older who smoke use menthol cigarettes, which is, that is why when we talk about menthol, we are saying that this is a Black health issue. When we talk about Black health and tobacco, we're talking about menthol. This is a very important equity issue when we're talking about flavored tobacco, why we always say especially menthol cigarettes because of its huge health disparity that it's caused. We also know, and I want to really highlight that when we're not just talking about menthol cigarettes, we're also talking about all flavored tobacco products like flavored cigars and cigarillos. Those are also very popular among Black youth who also reflect a high dual usage prevalence with cigarettes. And so that's extremely concerning when we know that the likelihood of Black youth that are smoking cigarettes are smoking menthol cigarettes, which are easier to pull that drag in and hold the breath longer. It feeds addiction even more and it makes it harder to quit. And they're dual using with flavored cigars and cigarillos. This is a very important thing to keep in mind when we're working on flavored tobacco policy, that it's not just about one product, but really ensuring that there aren't any alternative products for users to turn to in order to really feed that nicotine addiction. We also know there's a high prevalence of menthol cigarette use by LGBT youth who smoke. In this, the fact that I have, or the fourth bullet point that I have on the screen was information and data that was taken even before the youth vaping epidemic. So even before Juul hit the market and other, vaping products that are basically all flavored that kids really like, LGBT youth who smoke were already significantly using flavored tobacco products. And then we know, of course, like I already mentioned, that the youth vaping epidemic really caused high school student e-cigarette use to double over the course of several years, leading to the US Surgeon General to declare an epidemic. And we know that so many of these youth use flavored e-cigarette products. So that's flavored tobacco in general, and it's caused health disparities. It's caused significant devastation and health impact. Commercial tobacco use is a major contributing factor to the 3 leading causes of death for Black Americans: heart disease, cancer, and stroke. And it also is a huge contributor to developing diabetes, which is the 4th leading cause of death for Black Americans. So it is significantly impactful when we're talking about improving Black health and advancing health equities to address commercial tobacco use. We also know that even though Black Americans who smoke tend to smoke fewer cigarettes per day, initiate smoking later, and are more likely to attempt to quit, they're also more likely to die from tobacco-related disease and are less successful at cessation attempts than other racial groups. So again, the health disparities here cannot be understated. So typically when we talk about flavored tobacco, I've done presentations over and over again where we talk about how we got here, why flavored tobacco, caused this devastation and death. How did we get here? Is it just that flavored tobacco products are just so enticing? They could have been left in a basement and somebody would have found them and it would have went wild all over the globe. No, we know that this was part of a concerted effort from the tobacco industry to target groups that would influence consumer trends and also had very little political power and ability to fight them back. And so again, a typical presentation on flavored tobacco is to really go over the fact that the tobacco industry had an intentional and aggressive marketing campaign towards specific groups like African Americans with flavored tobacco products. And we can talk about the history and the information that's available, for example, on the University of California, San Francisco's tobacco research database, the tobacco industry document database, which just shows numerous evidence that the tobacco industry actually presented during the litigation against the leading cigarette manufacturers to show this serious marketing analysis that they did to really target specific groups with products that they knew would be extremely addictive and devastating to communities, families, and individuals. We also talk about the fact that, leading with the creation of menthol, new flavored products have come onto the market and they're developing as we go. And so, yes, we're talking about menthol cigarettes from the 1950s. And then we're talking about, the development of other flavored cigarettes, which came off the market, and I'll get to a little bit later on, but also, flavored cigars and flavored e-cigarettes. These are products that continue to develop. The tobacco industry is very adaptable. And so it's really important when we're talking about flavored tobacco regulation that it is comprehensive and it really covers all flavored tobacco products, because we do see trends with commercial tobacco users of turning to alternative products. With some exceptions, but the fact is that the tobacco industry is really good at figuring out how to continuously hook a new generation of children, really, in order to feed their dying consumer base. And, we can see that, especially when we look at e-cigarettes, they're using the same tactics when it comes to the development of e-cigarette products and their tactics to really target youth. So, when we're talking about e-cigarettes and vaping companies, that is big tobaccos. When I say big tobacco, I'm talking about e-cigarette companies as well. But, big tobacco companies like Altria, they have stock and jewel. So it literally is the same companies that are engaging in these same strategies. And then even these companies or small businesses, I guess, these vape shops that offer their own in-store mixing, et cetera. These companies are a part of the appeal, the allure of flavors. It's all a part of the profit scheme to really hook young consumers to become addicted to products that they truly do not understand how it's impacting their health. One thing I also want to mention when it comes to e-cigarette companies is the same strategies that they're using to target marginalized communities is still ongoing. So, dual pitching products to Native American tribes, for example, under the guise of being a cessation tool, even though they are not a designated cessation product. And if you want more on, the targeted history of the tobacco industry's targeting, specifically of African Americans, I encourage you to check out Black Lives, Black Lungs. It's a documentary that's available for free on YouTube, or you can go to the director's website, Lincoln Mondi, at lincolnmondi.com, because I'm not going to go into detail about how the tobacco industry has really permeated the Black community and really appropriated the culture and the struggle of, the Black Power movement, of, independence and freedom and music. But this is a really great resource to do that. We're just going to jump into the deeper aspect of the tobacco industry's insidious nature. And so when we do that, when we go deeper, yes, we are acknowledging all that the tobacco industry has done over the decades to really target marginalized communities, and specifically the Black community. And I just really want to go deeper now using a quote from an R.J. Reynolds tobacco company executive, which is, "We don't smoke that. We just sell it. We just sell it. We reserve the right to smoke for the young, the poor, the Black, and the stupid." So I want to think about that quote, or like everybody just take a minute to think about that. The young, the poor, the Black, and stupid. What does this quote bring to mind? I have a picture on the screen of a crumbling wall, something that clearly has not been maintained. And to me, this is really a reflection of how the tobacco industry has come to thrive in a country with privilege, racism in all forms, anti-Blackness, which, just as a description of how I'm looking at that, different from racism, anti-Blackness is specifically the intersection of, the poor, the Black, and stupid. The anti-Blackness as the basis for legalized racism, and really the quote being a reflection of that. Capitalism, poverty, political power, the the arrogance with which that quote was said. Suppression, manipulation, exploitation, intentionality, deception. These are much deeper themes that reflect a much deeper problem behind just the tobacco industry getting in the way of a local community's efforts to protect its community. This is about the tobacco industry taking advantage of a country and a system that was always set out to subjugate certain members. So let's talk about Black health in a country with and without menthol. So before and after the creation of menthol cigarettes, what did it look like? So, people have been smoking tobacco for a very long time. And I want to give another disclaimer when I'm talking about tobacco. I attempt to say commercial tobacco because we recognize that Indigenous American tribes have been using traditional tobacco for a very long time for religious, spiritual, and medicinal purposes, and that has since been appropriated. And so when I'm talking about commercial tobacco and tobacco use, I'm really talking about commercial tobacco products that have been manufactured, distributed, and sold for profit and cause death, disease. So, the creation of menthol cigarettes came in 1952 when Lloyd Hughes at home and figured out the fact that you can put flavor with your roll your own tobacco product. And so it quickly became a part of the cigarette market, but again, not to the extent that we see today. But before the 1960s, Black Americans who smoked and used menthol flavored products were not at the same level as we see today. So Black Americans who smoked non-flavored cigarettes were basically at the same rate as the overall population, which was substantially smoking non-menthol flavored cigarettes. But then by 2006, menthol flavored cigarettes comprised of 20% of the market. So that's it. And this is just menthol flavored cigarettes. These are cigarettes that have a distinguishable menthol flavor. They comprise of 20% of the market. So that serious growth in just over 50 years. But even with that growth, we are seeing that there was an even more significant change made up of the Black adults, again, not 12 and up as the statistic I showed you earlier, but Black adults who smoked menthol flavored cigarettes was up significantly, with now 75% of Black adults who smoking menthol flavored cigarettes. So you can see that there was a significantly higher change than the market change for Black Americans who smoked. And then by 2010, we saw menthol, whether it was distinguishable or indistinguishable, so whether you could tell it was flavored with menthol or not, in almost all tobacco products in order to make them more palatable, to mask the harshness, to increase the ease of taking in a drag and causing a cooling sensation so you can hold the drag in for longer. But I really want us to think about also what happened before the creation of cigarettes. Before the creation of menthol cigarettes, there was slavery and racism, and tobacco was always a part of that. So in the 17th and 18th century, tobacco was the most valuable export to Europe from the American colonies. And it actually was used as collateral in order to fund the Revolutionary War, making sure that tobacco profits could be used as collateral to the French in order to help us fund the Revolutionary War. And so really, when we're talking about tobacco, when we're talking about Black health, there's a deep, deep history. Tobacco addiction was a big driver of the American antebellum economy, and the importance on legalizing anti-Blackness to subjugate generations of enslaved Africans based on race was necessary in order to uphold the economy from the framework that that those who were in power at the time put forth. And so slavery and racism, and then the slavery and racism that drove tobacco agriculture and production and trade was really the foundation of health injustice. It's this idea that slavery and racism made it so, Black enslaved Africans, really their only relevance, the only relevance of their health was whether they were productive or not. So then in 1881, mass cigarette production began versus hand rolling. It was much faster and really changed the landscape for the tobacco industry. But still, even after the Civil War, when there was the abolishment of slavery, even though you can argue against that, and during the Reconstruction era, there was sharecropping, the practice of sharecropping, which is just another name for slavery, in that it led to unpaid labor, violence, and oppression under certain codes like the Black codes. So still Black people being subjected to working for the land that they live on, and not receiving any pay for their labor, and also facing all kinds of discrimination and violence. So these formerly enslaved African Americans were still harvesting tobacco crops, feeding still the mass cigarette production that began even during that time. So the idea that the injustice that we have seen for human rights and civil liberty violations for African Americans in this country is so closely related to tobacco. And then in the early 20th century, even before menthol cigarettes, again, we continue to see discrimination, oppression, violence, and exploitation. So all of these things, all these affronts and violations of Black health were happening even before menthol flavored cigarettes hit the market. And from the time that menthol cigarettes were invented in 1952 to today, we have continued to see exploitation, neglect, oppression, violence, and trauma against the Black community. And this is creating generations that have experienced and witnessed obstruction and theft and violence, trauma, neglect, injustice, deficient resources, oppressed political and financial power, and all other types of violations to Black bodies and communities. So it's just a piling and piling on top of that. And just know that the tobacco industry was built on this oppression. It has grown and thrived in it. It continues to exploit it. It continues to contribute to it. It has a significant interest in its maintenance. And so, when you see tobacco companies now, especially after the murder of George Floyd, I think you can go on Altria's website. I'll show a picture of it coming up. But their commitment to racial justice, their commitment to equity, it is such a slap in the face to understand not only that the industry was really built off of slavery and grew through systemic oppression, but also that it continues to contribute to it by pushing for things like preemption that not only prohibit local communities from protecting their residents from the harms of flavored tobacco, but also things like COVID-19 protections, voter protections, and the like. And so Black disease and death was significantly disparate compared to other races prior to the invention of menthol flavored cigarettes. And it worsened when it comes to tobacco related disease after the tobacco industry targeted the Black community with menthol cigarettes. And so, there has been a lot of discussion about the importance of pushing for flavored tobacco regulation in order to protect communities, and specifically already marginalized communities like the Black community with flavored tobacco regulation. Not all policies on a local level have been comprehensive and have included things like menthol cigarettes or other flavored tobacco products, or all retailers. But it's important to note that when it comes to flavored tobacco regulation, everything started locally, from New York City and Providence, Rhode Island, all the way to San Francisco. And now we have many, many, many jurisdictions, many in the state of Maryland, that have comprehensive flavored tobacco regulations that are protective of public health overall, and specifically Black health and the health of other marginalized communities. But this has not been without a headache. This has not been without a challenge. Communities, I'm sure many of you have probably been involved in policy work that has been thwarted by the tobacco industry. The tobacco industry has sued many local governments that have tried to enact protective flavored tobacco regulation, and have threatened a lot of communities that are looking to do that. And so they've really made it a really challenging prospect for a lot of communities that see it as a clear-cut way of advancing health equity. And, the way that they have really thwarted these efforts is to, reach into their playbook of being manipulative, being a manipulative injury. So, posing themselves as, an industry that really cares about things that matter to those who are most impacted by commercial tobacco products. So playing on things like racial and economic equity. Like I mentioned before, you can see a page from Altria's website where they are taking a stand against social justice and race equity with initiatives that they fund across the country, and showing, ironically, that they were one of the first to hire a Black man as a salesperson in the 1950s when Black people were not being hired by corporate America. It's this manipulation, it's the abuse of power that they have always relied on. And then turning to otherwise trusted faces to really speak to communities and start really spreading dis and misinformation about protective public health measures like flavored tobacco policy. And all that they're doing is really reusing and recycling the same arguments that they've used for decades to thwart these efforts. In the 1980s, they were saying, don't pass these anti-smoking laws. Don't pass the law that will prohibit smoking in restaurants and bars, because if you do, then the police will come and there will be discrimination against Black people and other minorities. And now today, again, they are using the same recycled messaging to show, don't pass full flavored tobacco measures because you will end up having, more police brutality that we already are tired of seeing. But they're smart now, because in the 1980s, even though they still weren't as credible as they were when they first became a power, since the lawsuits against the major cigarette manufacturers by all of the states and the federal government, they know that they don't have credibility to really speak directly to the public about concerns related to public health. And so they have been very strategic in who they choose to speak on their behalf. And it's very difficult to trace that. But when you look at the types of organizations that are really spreading the big tobacco's lies, you can see how manipulative it is because it's these otherwise very respected and trusted organizations. But luckily, we have a lot of public health organizations that are fighting and rebuting these tobacco industry misinformation talking points. I have one example on the screen from a public health law center. We at the Center for Black Health and Equity have a similar resource that really goes through and debunks each of the arguments that they are unfortunately pushing out. And really, these arguments are exploiting systemic racism, trauma, police brutality, very real issues that we need to address and that we know impact Black health and joy. But it is something that the tobacco industry knows will be the wrench to really kill sometimes the efforts of the community that are working to protect public health. And so it would seem, if these state and local governments are having such a hard time passing flavored tobacco policy, that the federal government would then step in and act. Well, actually, local governments started acting when there was a failure of the federal government to do something about so many flavored tobacco products. So back in, when the Tobacco Control Act was passed in 2009, there was very little done to regulate the sale of flavored products. All flavors in cigarettes, other than the menthol flavor, were prohibited in the Tobacco Control Act. But menthol was left off the table. This was a political decision because the science showed that of all products, menthol flavored cigarettes were especially concerning. And even at that time, there was an abundance of evidence to support that. And then, of course, it did not regulate all other flavored tobacco products like flavored cigars. And since that time, we know other products like flavored e-cigarettes have come onto the market. But there have been groups since the Tobacco Control Act was passed that has petitioned to the FDA to do something about, at least something about menthol as the characterizing flavor in cigarettes, as it did all other flavors, characterizing flavors in cigarettes. And the FDA did not act, even though its own scientific advisory committee had laid out a compelling argument for them to do the same. And so as I'm talking, I hope you're feeling, since I've talked about the country without menthol and slavery and sharecropping and continued oppression, and then local governments trying to protect its citizens, trying to advance health equity, and no help from the federal government, and the industry trying to really manipulate information and trick people into not supporting a policy that's protective of themselves. It's just a piling on of stress and difficulty and overwhelm, and that is the point. That is the point. That is a strategy. But we're so lucky that we have organizations like the African American Tobacco Control Leadership Council and other plaintiffs in a lawsuit, including Action on Smoking and Health, and other plaintiffs that decided enough is enough. We need to be proactive in legally pushing the FDA to remove menthol as a characterizing flavor in cigarettes. And so last year, the in 2020, I'm sorry, I'm getting my dates all mixed up. In 2020, there was a lawsuit filed against the FDA for its failure to act on adding menthol to the list of characterizing flavors in the Tobacco Control Act, which the Tobacco Control Act actually charged the FDA with looking into. And so when it did that, the FDA still did not take any action, but eventually last year, the FDA announced that it had made a decision to not only add menthol to the list of prohibited characterizing flavors in cigarettes, but that it would also be looking into flavored cigars and cigarillos as well, or little cigars. And so the announcement is a huge victory. Very glad that the FDA made a public statement that it would start to move forward with the administrative rulemaking process. But it's just really important to note that just the announcement to work forward towards a rulemaking process does not mean that menthol is banned. It does not mean that flavored cigars are now going to come off the shelves. And it also means that the FDA did not announce that they would do anything about flavored e-cigarettes when it comes to prohibiting their manufacturing. And so again, we're left in a situation where we're just waiting. It's a lot of words and waiting. And in the meantime, we're having COVID-19 hitting, marginalized communities so hard, and racial uprisings, and all of these things are still happening. All this continued oppression is still happening, and continued trauma. So, this FDA rulemaking process can take years, and it will likely be postponed by litigation brought by the tobacco industry. So it is not advisable to wait until the FDA actually, makes a move and goes forward with the rulemaking process. And so state and local governments continuing their work on prohibiting the sale of all flavored tobacco products and everything that goes into that, which means continued research on initiation and or prevention and cessation. All of that remains a critical strategy to improve health equity, and that shouldn't stop just because the FDA announced that it would soon start the rulemaking process. But now let's shift into the conversation of flavored tobacco policy efforts on a state and local level. If it's not centered in equity, it can be detrimental and ineffective, especially when we're in a country, in a landscape where we're oversaturated with the amount of equity issues that are being discussed on a daily basis. So when we're talking about flavored tobacco policy efforts, centering anything when it's talking about research, community engagement, prevention, education, policymaking, centering equity in all of that means to have a holistic understanding of what I mentioned earlier, which is how we got to this point, and then a community-centered and led approach to get us out. So that's a country without menthol historically, and a country without menthol looking forward, all with the intention of ensuring that health equity is intact and that we're actually advancing things like Black health. So when we're talking about moving forward in our prevention efforts with flavored tobacco products, I think it's really important when we're talking about equity-centered policy and specifically Black health, again, to ensure that the policy work is comprehensive, that we're pushing for full flavor bans with comprehensive language that covers all tobacco products in all settings without exception. Other policies to support that can supplement full flavor bans and would specifically advance Black health are addressing retailer density and increasing the price of commercial tobacco products. And then the other thing I'd like to say about working on full flavor policy bans is seeing if you can do something with the administrative aspect of those, licensing ordinances, zoning ordinances, or standalone ordinances, is to maybe do something or write in something about the fines and fees that come from tobacco retailer licensing for reparative programs, whether that's related to prevention or cessation. Is something about repairing the damage that the tobacco industry has done, specifically as it relates to health equity and equity in general. Also, when it comes to prevention, like I said, having a community-led process is really important. The tobacco industry is getting very good at riding this misinformation train, which is just running rampant when it comes to many different policy issues. And so making sure that the community most impacted in the jurisdiction that you're working in is involved in leading the way right from the beginning, not at the end, is very important to ensure the success of the policy pass. Because what could happen is if the tobacco industry is successful in its attempt to manipulate the narrative, you could see a devastating loss because the community most impacted was not involved and does not understand what the tobacco industry is doing. The other thing is, when the community is involved in these types of policymaking efforts, that you're funding these community groups to do the work that they do, and that this funding is trust-based. And when I say trust-based funding, it means that the burden of the administrative requirements of that giving is not so great that they can't actually do the work. And that it also respects the trauma involved in doing this work, because tobacco is so closely related with so much trauma, oppression, and devastation in the Black community. Having funding in which the reporting requirements and the scope and the timeline is respectful of all of that is really important. And then having a holistic approach when you're doing things like full flavor bans, that you're ensuring that it is the language of it is equity focused all the way through. So ensuring that there's equity centered enforcement measures. There's no PUP, there's no criminalization against individual consumers. Things like that are really important. Taking a different approach when it comes to full flavor bans in your messaging, especially with specific communities like the Black community, to highlight the racial injustice involved in flavored tobacco, bringing a human rights approach and talking about the violation of, the governments, local governments for not passing something like a full flavor ban when it has a responsibility to protect citizens' right to breathe clean air and not be targeted, like consumer protection laws, for example. Having a different approach in that aspect. And then also consider approaching full flavor bans in a different way. Perhaps it's something that can be folded into other policy movements like racism as a public health crisis. These are resolutions that are being passed all across the country that sometimes do incorporate actual policies when they are passed. Or working across the aisle with quote unquote non-traditional public policy partners like environmental justice. There was an effort that was that went to, I think maybe 100 mayors on the Mississippi, but the idea was that the mayors signed a resolution to support and push for policy that would reduce the amount of plastic pollution in the waterway, or that would enter the Mississippi waterway in their jurisdiction. And so working with environmental justice groups to show them, if we pass a full flavor ban, that would likely have an impact in reducing plastic pollution in our jurisdiction, because we know that commercial tobacco products are such a high, if not the top in some areas, plastic pollutant. And so just having a fresh approach and thinking of it in a different way. And when it comes to cessation, which I said is just as important when we're talking about taking these products off of the market, we also need to be thinking about, especially when it comes to the Black community, what people have used, commercial tobacco products to I guess, cosmetically relieve. And so there's data out there that talks about many Black people who smoke see their smoke breaks as a vacation, see their smoke breaks as a stress reliever, and also because menthol flavored cigarettes have become so permeated within the Black community, but because the tobacco industry has tried to make it a part of Black culture, which it's not, there are a lot of people who have memories associated with commercial tobacco use. So it is a very deep issue when it comes to removing something from someone's life, even though it's harmed them, that has been not only such a huge part of their story, but also it's tied up in their addiction. So being really sure that if we're pushing for these products to get off the market, we're also ensuring that people have what they need if they've been addicted to these products, sometimes even for decades. And so when we're doing cessation research, ensuring that the data is representative, and funding community-led research and not keeping it at such an academic level. Ensuring that cessation services, whether it's a quit line or a local cessation counseling service, is culturally competent and trauma informed, that it is community focused, and that whoever is involved in the programmatic planning or of that is ensuring that it's intersectional as well in its considerations, because we're talking about Black health and African Americans in general, but there are intersections of groups within the Black population that have, you know, their own unique oppression that they face and health harms as a result. Lastly, ensuring that cessation is accessible. I know that's been difficult with COVID-19, but I have heard of a lot of community groups that have coordinated with social services to ensure that cessation resources are getting to people who may not take it upon themselves to reach out for cessation support. But if they're getting things like, you know, if they're getting deliveries from a food shelf, for example, including, you know, a brochure or actual cessation resources within that food shelf delivery, that is also something to think about when you're trying to figure out how to navigate working on commercial tobacco in a COVID-19 world where everybody is talking about how to fix everything. Full flavor bans do support cessation, especially when it comes to Black health, because we know from some studies that a lot of Black people who do smoke menthol cigarettes say that if menthol cigarettes were not available to them, they would stop smoking versus look for an alternative product. And so we fully support full flavor bans and support of other policies, again, just like policies that dismantle systemic racism will have an impact on commercial tobacco, because systemic racism fuels flavored tobacco and nicotine addiction in the Black community. And so supporting those other policies while working on other flavor bans is something that we feel is really important, even when it comes to cessation, because people are otherwise healthy and happy, well rested, and restored. It's much easier to treat a nicotine addiction. And then lastly, for cessation, I'll just encourage the partnership with BIPOC professionals. So often when we're talking about cessation counseling, we see African Americans who smoke, you know, not underutilizing cessation resources that are available. And often that is because of the cultural competency of the services that are available to them and their comfort level to be able to talk about things like ancestral trauma and racial injustice. So in general, the takeaway is that, you know, the ongoing devastation of COVID-19 and the systemic racism that has always faced BIPOC groups reminds us that public health laws to address chronic disease like commercial tobacco-related disease has always been and remains important. And so now is the time to continue the work, regardless of the FDA announcement, to work on equitable, evidence-based commercial tobacco policies. And that includes prohibiting the sale of all flavored tobacco products, especially menthol cigarettes, without exception. And that's critical. But if we're going a little bit deeper with the takeaway, again, remember, racism has always been a public health emergency in the United States. And the tobacco industry, even before flavored products, has grown and thrived in the resulting oppression and devastation of systemic racism. And so a community-centered and preventative policy that prohibits the sale of all flavored products is critical to improving Black health and dismantling that component of systemic racism that really feeds the tobacco industry. And trauma-informed, culturally competent cessation support for Black people who have struggled with nicotine addiction due to their use of menthol-flavored cigarettes and other flavored products, either now or in the foreseeable future, is key to preventing the continuation of the stress and hardship that we know has come from systemic racism even prior to the existence of flavored tobacco products. So I'll leave you with this. A country without menthol is understanding how it once existed, the legalized systemic racism that allowed for slavery and the development of the tobacco industry, critically assessing its currently modified state, Now flavored tobacco products are on the market. And how did we get here? What does our system allow for the tobacco industry to do in order to take advantage of systemic oppression and grow and make money? And then intentionally working towards an evolved version of a country without menthol. So obviously we're not talking about returning to a country without menthol as it was in the early 20th century, 19th through 17th century. We're not talking about that. There were many things that we have grown from and many ways that things haven't changed, but we're not going back. What we want to think about though is working towards an evolved version where we're not only relieving the disease and death caused by flavored tobacco products, but we're also work on repairing the damage caused by systemic racism in general, because we know that's what feeds the monster of flavored tobacco. So a country without menthol will advance Black health, foster health equity, and improve public health overall. I don't know why this, okay. So my presentation was really based a lot in a guide that we have coming out. It's called the Health Justice in Tobacco Control Guide. Will be coming soon. So if you are a part of if you receive our newsletter or if you follow us on social media, you will be seeing that soon. If you'd like to be added, please email me. My email address is nphelps, that's NPHELPS at centerforblackhealth.org. And if you have any questions about the presentation or like image descriptions, please contact me. Now, I'm not sure, Carlo, if we have time for questions, but I've left time for that.
No, we do have time for questions. So I would, encourage folks to kind of ask. I had a question that I wrote in there a little bit about some examples. Now, maybe your this new document that you're coming up with will give us more about that, but examples of community focused and community kind of supported kind of initiatives. Is that more than just kind of reaching out to the community? Is it, how do you see that kind of operating? What examples have you seen?
Yeah, actually, so to answer your first question, yes, the examples of how to start a community-focused process towards addressing commercial tobacco and its impact on Black health will be in the Health Justice Guide. It's actually chapter 4 of the Health Justice Guide, if you want to write that down to bookmark it later. It is a 5-step approach to community engagement and in policymaking for tobacco policy. And so this is an approach that we have found success in with the grantees and communities that we've worked with. And really it is about, again, like I mentioned in the very beginning, the purpose of our organization is to grow capacity of the communities. And so it may seem as though the best thing to do when you're trying to do this flavored tobacco work is to approach, a well-known activist or a coalition that you're aware of that has worked with maybe local public health and on other aspects, or maybe they've worked on tobacco before and say, okay, let's move forward to push this flavored tobacco policy. That is all well and good. And that might be the approach that makes sense for your jurisdiction. But I think it would be really important to first acknowledge whether that whatever your community contact, the organization, or the person that you're working with has the capacity to sustain that work. Because what ends up happening, I think, when you're seeing a lot of failure for the flavored tobacco work is that either people run out of gas or they don't have a solid enough foundation to ensure that they are reaching all members within the community. And if there's a crack in the foundation, that's where the tobacco industry will really go in and disrupt things. Personally, we feel it's better to build community capacity to ensure that there's long-term success, even if that means that maybe the targeted date for passing a flavor ban is 5 months from now. If you're working with the community and they say we need more time, we think it's better to invest in that community and ensure that they have the support that they need and the buy-in that they need to then move forward. That makes more sense because even if you were to be successful at passing that policy, understand that if there's not buy-in, there might be resentment that might flood into neighboring communities. And there also could potentially be that continued devastation that I talked about, which is, communities not really understanding why, once again, the government took something, from them, that they saw, maybe, like I said, cosmetically, they may have the perception that it is a part of their well-being because it's an escape from the onslaught of stress and and trauma that they go through. Right. So That's what I would say, if you just start with the conversation of how can we best help you? This is what we like to see. This is how we see this improving Black health. What do you think makes sense for the community here in building your capacity to make this work for the long term?
Good. Are there other questions or comments or thoughts?
Yeah, thank you, Natasha. We'll give people a couple moments in case anyone's typing. Again, just feel free to put your questions in the chat.
So while we're waiting for that, Natasha, I mean, that's an interesting kind of piece that there seems to be some ownership of the menthol in the community because it is so much a part of the community.
Yeah, I mean, I think anytime you're doing public health work, it makes sense to really incorporate and allow for leadership of those who are most impacted by the by the issue that you're trying to resolve. And so when it comes to menthol, like I said, if we're talking about menthol, it's a Black health issue. It's not that it doesn't impact others, of course it does, but it's about the disparities that we recognize. And that doesn't necessarily apply to every community. There's sometimes not a lot of diversity in certain communities, and maybe it makes more sense that it is, the community, what it means to be community-led is not just, make sure you have Black people in your community to push this forward. You work with what you have. There's no one size fits all policy or one size fits all community-centered approach. But I really think that the biggest thing to take from my presentation, at least, or I'm hoping what people walk away with, is to think about flavored tobacco policy work beyond just flavored tobacco policy, to really consider the fact that institutional, structural, systemic racism fuels it, and really started it, fuels it, and is so much more than just the tobacco industry targeting and the availability of the products and the price of the products that drive people deeper into a nicotine addiction with the use of those products. So just taking a step back and thinking a little bit more about that, and then being very intentional with that in mind in how you move forward engaging with the community.
All right, it looks like we got a question. Thank you for this presentation. I'm wondering if you're aware of any efforts that focus on engaging college students and other young adults, so 18 plus, around advocating about these issues.
Yeah, that's a great question. I do have a couple of examples that are floating around in my mind. Please do email me too if you want to have a more in-depth conversation, because our programs director could actually give you more detail than I can. But there have been a lot of examples. Yeah, I feel that young adults are really driving they're making the conversation about flavored tobacco fresh. Again, they're most interested in the social justice aspect of it, and really highlighting the tobacco industry's predatory tactics, and feeding. Again, it's like the idea of targeting people who are already being damaged in these other ways. I think the work that was done in the Oakland area, San Francisco, and most recently in Sacramento County in California is a really great example of engaging with young adults on pushing forward with that narrative, which was really helpful when the tobacco industry tried to come in and again try to manipulate the narrative. So the work out there, that's the SOL project, SOL project, was leading that work in Sacramento County, and they've done a really great job. I think they have a good community-centered approach, really highlighting young adults and bringing in things like art, and again, that social justice, human rights aspect. I also think there has been some interesting discussion. I'm not remembering the jurisdiction, so I don't want to speak offhand. But there was, I won't say the jurisdiction because I'm not sure if it's true, but I have seen some young adults taking an interest in really incorporating an environmental justice aspect to the tobacco work, not only talking about the agriculture of tobacco and bringing it global and saying like, oh, when we buy tobacco products, we're feeding this global, this global climate, disaster chain, but also talking about plastic pollution, doing pickups around school, like on college campuses, with the use of e-cigarette products and jewel pods littering college campuses, a lot of drives for, picking up those products. I know that, I'll just say, I know that MD Anderson is working closely with colleges and universities, and specifically working in Texas with students to talk about commercial tobacco-free policies. So it's not necessarily directly on flavored tobacco work, but that type of messaging and approach is useful in flavored tobacco work as well. And there actually has been discussion about how to use the commercial tobacco-free grounds efforts to, look at supporting policies that are off-campus policies as well.
Great, thank you so much. Does anyone else have any other questions? I will say in a couple moments, we'll be opening the breakout rooms. So when we do that, you'll be automatically moved to the workshop you selected during registration. And our team members will provide additional information once you are in their room. Carlo, did you have anything?
Yeah, let me just say thank you, Natasha, for that wonderful talk and for all of the work that you're doing. I mean, I think you've added a kind of a dimension to kind of the menthol discussion that is very helpful to us and to kind of allowing us to kind of see the broader perspective and the community piece. And I have a sense that that's also happening in the group that's here. Some of the folks have really, even though they haven't well, they're putting it in the chat now, thanking you and talking about how phenomenal the proposal was. So I really appreciate that. I think if you can, we'll try and kind of track when that new kind of manual comes out, because I think that would be really useful to have here and for us to kind of be able to promote it also in the community here from the Tobacco Resource Center.
Great. I'm making a note to send it to you once it's publicized. And there will be a webinar also with some really great panelists to specifically talk about the community engagement.
Okay.
Of it. So make sure
that would be terrific to have both of those.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your comments, and thank you very much for having me.
Okay. Thank you, Natasha. You're getting a virtual applause